Good morning. I am James Potts. I use he, him pronouns. And it is good to be back with you this year for this queer-led service. Thank you to Hardy and Ananda for extending the invitation. So, as I said, my name is James, not Jim, not Jimmy. It's James. And you would think that this would be something that's relatively easy. It's 5 letters, 1 syllable. It really isn't that complicated. And yet, throughout my entire life, people have tried to call me all kinds of names. Jim is probably the most common. Jimmy gets thrown in there occasionally. But I've also been called Jeff more times than I can count. Because apparently, as long as people remember that my name starts with J, anything goes. But there's also another name that a small handful of people are allowed to call me. And that name is Rupert. Now, clearly, there's a story here. So, I have 3 older sisters. Which might explain a few things. But all 3 of them have names that start with R. And by accident, or maybe intentionally, their names are also alphabetical by age: Rachel, Rebecca, and Robin. And then I came along, James. The story goes that my Mom was going to be able to name the girls, and my dad would name the boys. And at some point, some of my friends decided that I needed an R name, like my sisters. And that if I was given an R name, it needed to be 2 things. 1, it needed to be alphabetical, and it needed to be something suitably ridiculous. So the 2 leading candidates, because we're not counting Y as a vowel, because Ryan would be really obvious. So we're not counting Y. So the top 2 candidates were Rudyard, like Rudyard Kipling, or Rupert, like the ever-attractive actor Rupert Everett. And Rupert was the one that stuck. So now that small group of friends calls me Rupert, and I don't mind. I kind of like it. And because life occasionally has a weird sense of humor, Rupert also happens to be the middle name of my boyfriend. But just because those people get to call me Rupert does not now mean that you all get to call me Rupert. You have not earned the Rupert privileges. But that's the funny thing about names, right? The name itself is only part of the story. Who says the name matters. How they say it matters. The relationship behind it matters. See, Rupert sounds perfectly normal coming from my close friends. If one of you walks up to me after worship and says, "Great sermon, Rupert," we're gonna have words. And I imagine that most, if not all of you, know exactly what I mean. Maybe you have a name that people try to shorten without asking. Maybe there's a nickname that only your family is allowed to use. Maybe your partner calls you something that sounds perfectly wonderful coming from them, but deeply disturbing coming from anyone else. Someone else hears that name and thinks, "Oh, that's cute, I'm gonna start calling you that too." No, we don't know each other like that. Because names carry relationships. They carry our stories. There are names that we were given, names that we chose, names that we grew into, some names we leave behind. There are names that people say that make us smile because of who said it. There may even be a name that someone once called us that we would give anything to hear them say one more time. And for some people, discovering their name is part of discovering themselves. There are people here in this room, and certainly people throughout the queer community, who know exactly what it feels like to finally hear someone call them by their name. To hear their name spoken with love and respect and think, yeah, that's me. And there are people who know the pain of having someone intentionally refuse to use it. Our names matter. When I was doing clinical pastoral education, or CPE, my supervisor used to ask my cohort a question: what is the most important word in any language? And of course, we were a bunch of people studying to be pastors, so we gave very pastory answers: love, hope, faith, grace. We were seminarians, so we were going to theologize that question to death. But after we would throw out words that we thought were the answer, he would say, no. The most important word in any language is your name. And that is something that has stuck with me for the last decade. Because there's something about hearing your own name. In a crowded room, it can get your attention. Spoken by someone that you love, it makes you smile. Spoken by someone who truly knows you, it carries the whole relationship inside of it. And spoken correctly, intentionally, with care, it can say something incredibly simple and incredibly important. When someone says your name, it means, I see you. And maybe that's why this little sentence in Isaiah carries so much weight. I have called you by name. God doesn't simply know something about you. God knows you. The name you were given, the name you chose, the name that makes you turn your head and think, oh yeah, that's me. And then God says, you are mine. But it's not the kind of mine that is like a possession. It's belonging. Like, that's my friend. That's my kid. That's my person. And I feel like we've all experienced something like this. A graduation, a concert, or a sporting event, maybe even a parade. You're up there doing your thing, and then suddenly, somewhere from out in the crowd, you hear, that's my baby! I feel like every parent has threatened that at one time. And you're immediately thinking, oh, please stop. But they're not going to, because they're proud of you. You are their person, and they just want to shout it so that way everybody in a 3-block radius knows it. And I've been thinking about this as I've been preparing for today, because there's a particular kind of parent at Pride, and I think we all know who that parent is. You may be that parent. Their kid came out and mom was like, okay, we're gonna do this. And suddenly, she owns every rainbow product ever manufactured. Rainbow shirt, rainbow earrings, a rainbow hat, rainbow socks, flags, extra flags just in case, buttons, things that she didn't even know existed 3 weeks ago. Corporate America has been preparing all year for this parent. And then when her kid walks by in the parade, that's my kid. That's my kid, and I love them. And I wonder if somewhere along the way we were given the wrong picture of God. So many of us were handed an image of God standing on the sidelines with crossed arms, a clipboard, and a checklist, watching, evaluating, keeping score. And queer people have been handed a particularly vicious version of that God. A God whose love always comes with an asterisk. God loves you, but, or you're welcome here as long as, you can belong if. But that's not the God that's speaking here in Isaiah. Listen to what God actually says. God says, I have called you by name. You are mine. And then goes on to say, you are precious in my eyes. You are honored, and I love you. Isaiah's laying it on pretty thick. And God apparently didn't get the memo that Presbyterians prefer our emotions decently and in order, preferably in the bulletin with 2 weeks advance, an email, the newsletter, the worship slides. God isn't saying, you're fine. God isn't saying, I guess you can stay. God is not saying, I guess we can find a folding chair and make a space for you. God is saying, you are precious. And precious isn't a light word. It's not a restrained word. Nobody looks at something that's precious to them and said, yes, I find this reasonably satisfactory. Precious has some real weight behind it. Precious is the picture that you show people who absolutely did not ask to see it. Precious is delight that refuses to play it cool. And God looks at you, each and every one of you, and says, you are precious in my eyes. And there's an enormous difference between being accepted and being called precious. Acceptance says, there's room for you. Precious says, I was really hoping you'd be here. Acceptance says, yeah, you can come. But precious says, it really wouldn't be the same without you here. Inclusion is good. Welcome matters. Acceptance can save lives. But maybe God is calling us beyond acceptance. Because nobody wants to spend their lives being tolerated. We want to know that our presence brings joy. We want somebody to light up when they see us. We want somebody somewhere to shout, that's my person. Maybe you've had people like that throughout your whole life. Parents who cheered for you, grandparents who adored you, friends who knew exactly who you were and loved you for it. That's a real gift. Maybe you found those people, those cheerleaders later in life. Friends, partners, chosen family, a church community. People who learned your name and said, we are so glad that you're here. Or maybe you're still learning to believe that you deserve that kind of love. That's why these words matter here in Isaiah. You are precious in my eyes. You are honored, and I love you. God doesn't say, once you improve, you'll be precious. God isn't saying, if you become the person everyone expects you to be, then I will call you by name. God is simply speaking love. And notice, Isaiah doesn't promise that precious people get easy lives. There are still waters. There are still rivers. There is still fire. The promise isn't nothing difficult will happen. The promise is, I will be with you. You don't become less precious when the waters get deep. You don't become less beloved when life gets messy. You don't lose your name when the world refuses to say it correctly. Through all of it, God says, I have called you by name. I am with you. And what might happen if we actually believed that? And not just for everybody else, because that's sometimes easier. What would change if you walked into a room knowing that your worth was not up for a vote? What if every queer kid heard from the church, not just simply, there's room for you, but rather, we are so much better because you are here? What if every trans person heard their name spoken with joy? Because God already knows your name, and you are precious. Before we finish, I want to invite you to do something. You didn't know there was going to be a test. You don't need to say anything out loud. I just want you to think about your name. Maybe it's the name that your parents gave you. Maybe it's a name that you chose. Maybe it's a name that you've had your entire life. Maybe it's a relatively new name. Hear your name in your mind. Your name. Not the label that somebody put on you. Not somebody else's expectation of you. Your name. And now hear these words. I have called you by name. You are mine. You are precious in my eyes. You are honored, and I love you. That's what God says every time God says your name. And that's the image that I want us to carry here from this place today. Not a God standing at a distance with crossed arms and a clipboard, a checklist. Picture instead the God here in Isaiah 43, somewhere on the sidelines of your life. And imagine God has gone completely overboard. God is wearing the rainbow shirt, the rainbow hat, the rainbow earrings, covered head to toe in glitter. And God is holding an enormous homemade sign that has your name written on it. And when you finally come into view, God loses all composure, points directly at you, and shouts for everyone in heaven and earth to hear, that's my person. That's my beloved. I know their name, and they are precious to me. And friends, God isn't embarrassed about it. Not at all. Thanks be to God.